and welcome to the Mathematicians Podcast, the podcast where we follow the fascinating stories behind the people that count in the history of mathematics. I'm your host, Benjamin Cornish, and today we are journeying back to, let me check my notes here, oh look, once again it's ancient Greece, to meet a mathematician, philosopher, and polymath, and as a first for this podcast, engineer whose innovative work in geometry continues to inspire and intrigue, Hippias of Elis. Now, there's a curious thing about puzzles, isn't there? Whether it's a jigsaw, a Rubik's Cube, or even just trying to untangle a set of earbuds. It's not just about the solution, it's about the process, that itch in the back of your brain when you're close, that moment when everything clicks. Now, here's a thought. What if the rules you've been following to solve the puzzle aren't the only way? What if there's a shortcut? A sneaky, elegant trick that changes the game entirely? Suddenly, the puzzle isn't just a challenge, it's a revelation. I used to have a friend who insisted on eating a sandwich upside down, arguing that the better distribution of flavours was worth the odd looks. It didn't make sense until I tried it, but they weren't wrong. The point is, whether it's puzzles, sandwiches, or even the universe's rules of geometry, the act of stepping outside of conventional boundaries can reveal something extraordinary. But it also raises questions. Is breaking the rules fair? Is it wise? Does it matter if the result is beautiful? And that brings us to today's topic, Hippias of Elis, a man who dared to think outside the box, or rather, outside the straight edge and compass. His ideas didn't always fit neatly into the rigid framework of his time, but they gave us something new to chew on. For maths enthusiasts and educators alike, Hippias offers a compelling story, not just for his contributions to mathematics, but for the way he embodies the interconnectedness of ideas across disciplines. So let's slide in and explore his life, his mathematical achievements, and why he deserves a place in the pantheon of mathematical greats. To understand Hippias, we first need to set the stage. He lived during the 5th century BCE, a time of intellectual ferment in ancient Greece. This was the age of the sophists, travelling teachers and thinkers who taught rhetoric, ethics, and philosophy for a fee. Hippias was one of these sophists, and like many of his contemporaries, he was a polymath. Hailing from Elis, a city in the western Peloponnese, Hippias was renowned for his vast knowledge. He wasn't just a mathematician, he was a poet, astronomer, historian, and musician. In fact, he prided himself on self-sufficiency, reportedly claiming to have made all of his clothes, and even his own shoes. Admittedly, he is not the only ancient Greek to claim this title. Diogenes the Cynic also made all his own clothes, and he didn't even need to use cloth. But Hippias is not remembered for his sartorial skills. His contributions to mathematics, particularly geometry, are where he left an enduring legacy. His work bridges the worlds of philosophy and mathematics, a hallmark of Greek thought. Let's start with Hippias's most famous mathematical contribution, the quadratrix. This was one of the first examples in Greek mathematics of a curve defined by motion, rather than static geometric construction. It's also the first example of a curve we find that is not a straight line or a circle. So what exactly is the quadratrix, and why is it so important? Imagine a square with rotating line that pivots from one side to another about a corner, while a second line moves uniformly downward from the top edge. The quadratrix is the curve traced by the intersection of these two moving lines. Perhaps here it is better to imagine the tool that Hippias created in order to achieve this, the quadratrix compass. It takes two arms and moves them both simultaneously. One arm acts like a traditional compass, rotating about the point, but without a scribe at the moving end. The second arm remains at the same angle as it begins, but is instead translated towards the centre of rotation. The traditional setup has the second arm sitting horizontally and moving vertically down towards the centre of rotation. The scribe then sits at the intersection of these two arms and slides along each as required. The second arm then completes its path in proportion to the angular motion of the first arm. Again, traditionally this would be following a line of length equal to the radius of the circular arc, completing the journey in equal time to that of the quarter arc drawn. Although this was most likely built requiring two motions, a rotation and translation, which would require a great deal of coordination to sketch accurately, it is possible to design a setup with a singular action, and thus guarantee the accuracy of the quadratrix. If you wrap a thread around a circle attached to the rotating arm of radius 2/pi, then attach the thread to the horizontal bar, the thread would be a length of 1 unit after a quarter turn. Now, this all might sound abstract, so let's focus in on the properties of the curve rather than its construction. The curve's unique property is that it divides angles into proportional segments. In simpler terms, if you wanted to trisect an angle, something impossible with just a compass and straightedge, you could use the quadratrix to do it. Moreover, you can now divide an angle into any arbitrary equal sectors. For the Greeks, trisecting an angle was one of the great unsolved problems of geometry, alongside doubling the cube and squaring the circle. These challenges drove Greek mathematicians to their limits. Hippias's quadratrix didn't solve all these problems, but it was a breakthrough in showing how curves could be used to tackle them. This break from the more Puritan view of only a compass and straightedge also helped to push the dial for later constructionists, as we will see in a few episodes when we explore the Neusis construction. We now know that the angle trisection is impossible with only a straightedge and compass, but this wasn't proven until 1837 by Pierre Wansel. Moreover, we can say for any non-zero integer n, an angle of measure 2π over n radians can be divided into n equal parts with a straightedge and compass, if and only if n is either a power of 2 or is a power of 2 multiplied by the product of one or more distinct Fermat primes, none of which divides n. In the case of trisection, where n is equal to 3, which is a Fermat prime, this condition becomes the above-mentioned requirement that n not be divisible by 3, if by any chance we wanted to say that. Also, a small teaser, we will come back to the quadratrix in a later episode when we meet Dinostratus, who once again tackles the problem of squaring the circle. So why was the quadratrix so revolutionary? To answer that, we need to think like the Greeks. Geometry for them was about purity and perfection. The tools of the trade, the compass and straightedge, represented this ideal. But Hippias's quadratrix introduced something new, the concept of motion in geometry. This was controversial. Many mathematicians, including Plato, dismissed such methods as impure. For some, like Zeno, the concept of motion itself was a point of contention. They wanted solutions that adhered strictly to the rules of compass and straightedge constructions. I should take a moment to acknowledge what you might assume is a missed pun. Rules and rulers, but of course we say straightedge and not ruler for a reason. That is, you're not allowed to measure any length on a straightedge, only the direction. And yet, Hippias's work hinted at a broader mathematical universe, one that would later flourish with the development of calculus and analytical geometry. Hippias's willingness to explore beyond traditional methods reflects his sophist background. As a sophist, he valued practical application and rhetorical skill over rigid adherence to tradition. His curve was not just a mathematical tool, it was a philosophical statement about the nature of knowledge and problem solving. Given that we are talking philosophy for a moment, perhaps we should clarify what we mean by a sophist. And surely there is no greater authority to appeal to than Plato himself. Plato saw the sophists as skilled orators who excelled at persuasive speech but lacked a commitment to discovering objective truths. I like to think a bit like me. In dialogues like the Gorgias and Protagoras, he criticised their tendency to use rhetoric as a means of manipulating opinions rather than pursuing knowledge. To Plato, they were more concerned with winning arguments than with the ethical or philosophical substance of their claims. In an example from the Gorgias, Socrates suggests that sophists are akin to cooks who create pleasant-tasting but unhealthy meals, contrasting them with philosophers who strive for the health of the soul. Plato associated the sophists with moral relativism, particularly through figures like Protagoras, who famously claimed that man is the measure of all things. To Plato, this kind of relativism undermined the possibility of objective standards of justice, virtue, or knowledge. In the Theaetetus, he critiques this perspective, arguing that it leads to a fragmented and unstable understanding of reality. Plato often depicted the sophists as teaching for money, which he saw as corrupting the pursuit of wisdom. In dialogues, like the Protagoras, he portrayed them as educators who prioritized profit over the ethical developments of their students. To Plato, true philosophy could not be bought or sold. It was a lifelong pursuit of truth that required dedication and moral integrity. I must say this critique of the exchange of wisdom for money hits me hard, but hey, a mathematician's got to eat. Plato frequently accused the sophists of cultivating the appearance of wisdom rather than genuine understanding. In The Sophist, he suggests that they are like shadow painters, creating illusions of knowledge that impress but do not illuminate. This criticism reflects Plato's concern that sophists relied on clever but superficial arguments to appear wise while lacking a deeper grasp of reality. On the topic of appearing to be wise while lacking a deeper grasp of reality, I'll take another moment to say the obliquity of the ecliptic. So, I guess that leaves the question open. Has Hippias actually trisected an angle? In a sense, no, because he did not do it using the accepted tools and norms. But has he created a convincing argument that pretends to be knowledge but is in fact just shadow painting? Or perhaps that analysis is too unkind. Just because the quadratrix is not yet, in the 5th century BCE, understood, does not mean it lacks any rigour. We only have to wait for Descartes to provide us with the coordinate geometry tools needed to measure the quadratrix formally. We can then see that it fits in neatly with analytic geometry way ahead of its time. You might be wondering, was the quadratrix useful in Hippias's time? The answer is both yes and no. While it couldn't be constructed using the classical tools of Greek geometry, its theoretical properties were invaluable. For instance, the quadratrix offered a way to think about continuous motion, a concept that would later underpin the development of calculus. The curve also inspired future mathematicians to explore non-Euclidean geometries and the possibilities of curved spaces. Hippias's work had an especially profound influence on later Greek mathematicians like Pappus and Proclus, who analysed and extended his ideas. Although the quadratrix couldn't be physically drawn in its entirety, it symbolised a shift in mathematical thinking towards abstraction and the use of hypothetical tools. The reason I have bestowed Hippias with the title of the first engineer is that his quadratrix is our first recorded example of a mechanism, that is, a device that transforms an input force into a desired output force, generally comprised of rods, levers, cams, gears, etc. A common example is the piston on a steam engine that oscillates back and forth, which converts into a rotational force applied to the wheels. We should note, as we often must, that this does not mean that a mechanism did not exist before Hippias. After all, the Great Pyramid of Giza was built 2,000 years before Hippias was alive, and they must have lifted those stones somehow. Then again, if you ask my brother, he will confidently tell you it was aliens. Humans have always been able to make use of mechanical advantage from the first time they picked up a stick. But Hippias gets the prize for being the first recorded thinker to design a tool. Let's step back a moment and consider Hippias not just as a mathematician, but as a thinker. His polymathic nature is something that we don't see often today, but it was central to his identity. Hippias didn't compartmentalise his knowledge. To him, geometry, philosophy, music, and history were all part of a larger quest for understanding. This interdisciplinary approach is something we can learn from, especially in today's world where specialisation often comes at the expense of breadth. Imagine Hippias lecturing in the Agora, seamlessly transitioning from a discussion on the quadratrix to a recitation of his poetry or an analysis of a historical event. His ability to connect ideas across disciplines makes him a quintessential sophist and a pioneer in integrated thinking. Sadly, there are no surviving works of Hippias' poetry, so we can only guess at his linguistic talents. And guess I shall. I think it may have sounded a bit like this. There once was a sophist named Hippias, whose geometry tricks were insidious. With his clever quadratrix he divided some tricks and made angle trisectors delirious. Of course, when spoken in Attic Greek, the rhyme and meter would be off just a little bit. So what can modern mathematicians and educators take away from Hippias of Elis? First, there's his inventive spirit. He wasn't afraid to challenge conventions or explore new methods, even when they were controversial. Second, there's his holistic approach to knowledge. Hippias reminds us that mathematics doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's deeply intertwined with philosophy, physics, art, and even ethics. Finally, there's his adaptability. As a sophist, Hippias was always learning, teaching, and evolving. In a rapidly changing world, this ability to adapt and think broadly is more important than ever. Hippias of Elis may not be as famous as Euclid for his geometry, or as Archimedes for his engineering, or as Socrates for his ethics, but his contributions to mathematics and philosophy deserve our attention. His quadratrix was a bold step into uncharted territory, challenging the boundaries of Greek geometry. More than that, Hippias represents the kind of thinker we should celebrate, curious, creative, and unafraid to bridge the gap between disciplines. Well, thank you for joining me on this journey through life and the work of Hippias of Elis. If you enjoyed this episode of The Mathematicians Podcast, don't forget to subscribe and share it with your fellow maths lovers and educators. You can also follow the pod on Instagram at mathematicians.pod for slightly less serious content. Next time, we will be spiralling out of control due to the excitement brought about by Theodorus. You'd be loopy to miss next week's The Mathematicians Podcast. Until then, goodbye. The music today is Danse Macabre Finale by Kevin MacLeod. You can find more information in the show notes.